Today's discussion is about the presence of colonialism and Pope's representation of colonialism in The Rape of the Lock. And I have titled my presentation, That Dressing Table, The Rape of the Lock and the World of Colonial Objects. Now, my hypothesis and my introduction is about Pope's presentation of colonialism, or Pope's representation of colonialism in The Rape of the Lock, as being extremely subtle and pervasive. While the satire and the mock heroic remain the focus of the poem, it is replete with the presence of colonial objects. Conditioned by the rapid growth in pre-industrial capitalistic endeavor, England at this point of time was flush with the presence of objects across the globe. While criticizing the leisurely world of the aristocracy, Pope's poem reveals a fascination with and validation of the spoils of colonialism and imperialism in the reference to the three continents, the objects, and the implicit awareness of the latent violence. This then is my introduction to the issue. We'd like to point out that after 1700, English imperialism witnessed a major leap towards trade. Christopher Hill has pointed out that this was the age of England's first empire, a mercantile system characterized by protectionism, favorable balance of trade, coercive control over colonial production and commerce, the accumulation of precious metals, and a hostility towards other major powers. In 1718, Jocelyn described the wide range of objects traded, including saltpeter, indigo, muslins, cotton, yarn, calico, and other very precious fabrics, including silk, diamonds, drugs, coffee, and of course tea, spices, ivory, honey, wine, and perfumes. Many of these objects are obviously present in the text of the poem, and Pope saturates the text with objects. There are also references to animals, especially lapdogs, and more insidiously to people, referring to a thriving slave trade from the African continent. Pope's poem has often been read in terms of the thesis of commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism is present when products acquire their value not from their utility, but being exchanged for other products, so that every object comes to be viewed not only in itself, but in terms of those other objects. Pope's art is one of indiscriminate proliferation that is especially marked in the dressing table of Belinda. We need to note that Belinda's world is one of sublime beauty, a large part of which is due to a hyperbolic description of her physical beauty, but it is equally sublime because of the beauty of the objects around her, a recognition that these objects possess almost a life of their own. There is also this presentation of a wide gamut of objects strewn indiscriminately on Belinda's dressing table. The suggestion being the rapid and wide range of objects that colonialism had gathered. This might be observed in the silver watch, the downy pillow, India's glowing gems, Arabia's perfumes, the combs made from ivory and tortoise shells, the rich brocade that Belinda wears, the porcelain cups that adorn the tea table, and so on and so forth. In fact, so profuse are the objects that Pope refers to them as unnumbered treasures opening at once. And they are brought in from the widest range of cartographical spaces, including the 3 continents and far distant China, which was the last frontier to fall. Tea and porcelain, of course, are the ultimate symbols of these colonial riches. The presence of tea is interesting not because of its value only, but also since it created a new ritual of the tea table and therefore of an aristocratic shift in culture. This, therefore, is the example of colonialism causing a whole new cultural transition. The locus of this transition, of course, was the court of Queen Anne, where all these objects would, of course, gather. However, one must note that Pope is aware of the violent activities that colonialism was entrenched in. The mock heroic is used with great skill in this context. Pope replaces the masculine violent world of imperial Rome by the feminine world of Belinda, but there's always the latent suggestion of the awareness of the colonial process. The various offerings of the world are culled with curious toil, and the possessions deck Belinda with glittering spoil. The line, awful beauty puts on all its charms, is both sublimely beautiful and devastatingly violent. This same mock heroic comic dissolution of violence is seen in the game of Ombre, where the playful masks the racial violence unleashed on the different continents, where the English army routs Asia's troops and Africa's sable sons, and where different nations exist in a state of confusion and fall in heaps on heaps. The card and the country are therefore both demolished in the text. But this art is extremely subtle and comic, largely due to the feminization of the epic, with Belinda at the center. The violence forever is overshadowed by her celestial beauty, and the mighty rage is concealed in her soft bosom. The most crucial episode in this case is the Epic Armour and the toilet scene, where puffs, powders, and patches exist with billet doux. The suggestion being that within the colonial world, there is the conjunction of the religious and the political, where missionaries and the conquerors coexist happily with one another. Thus, within the colonial, the sacred and the profane the political and the missionary come seamlessly together. Nowhere is this most evident as in the particular description of Belinda and the white cross that she wears on her white breast. Belinda therefore becomes a symbol of the British Empire with her sparkling beauty and with the objects that deck her body. Here one notes Pope's double vision. He is satirical of the aristocracy, yet fascinated by the world of their objects. The final apotheosis of the lock into the star is probably a sublimation of the British Empire into the world's most dominant colonial power. Pope carefully uses two rhetorical devices to achieve this axis between the mock heroic and the political. His first use is of the metonymic axis, where there is a careful replacement of the part for the whole. In this case, Belinda's body, representing the body of the empire, just as Crusoe's island represented the empire in Defoe's text. The other major rhetorical device to be used is the zeugma, which not only attaches the heroic and the mock heroic, but also the political and the colonial. Thus, Queen Anne takes both counsel and tea. Counsel to extend colonialism and tea as a product of that colonial endeavor. The nymph's honor is equated with the frail china jar receiving a flaw, creating a moment when the female body and the colonial object almost merge. In these instances, the close interaction between colonial object, violent accession, and the political capital that it creates is subtly highlighted. One must note the presence of the merchant in this context. Pope refers only in passing to the merchant from the exchange returning in peace. His labor is contrasted with the fruitless labor of Belinda. and a new class orientation seems to be indicated. The idle aristocracy is the subject of critique because it is the receiver of the goods, while the true hero is the acquisitive merchant who proceeds on trading. This new class alignment with the coexistence of the merchant and the aristocrat can also be observed in Addison's Spectator papers, where Sir Roger de Coverley, the aristocrat, sits on board with Sir Andrew Freeport, the merchant who considers the sea, SEA, the sea, the British common. One final point needs to be made. Pope's poem is, after all, about the woman and the violation of her lock and thereby her body. There is a deep patriarchal control and misogyny within the text, especially in Clarissa's speech, where a passive acceptance of male dominion is sought. The patriarchal and the colonial overlap in the sense that the violence of the rape and plunder are parallel, alluded to, and comically dissolved. Yet, both the woman and the colonized are subjects of rape, plunder, and violence, as can be observed in Crusoe's acquisition of the island and the submission of Friday. In Defoe's text, Crusoe automatically becomes the lord of all that he surveys. It is therefore that the politics of the poem is a subtle validation of the process and politics of colonialism and imperialism, which overlap with similar strategies of patriarchy. Pope's uniqueness lies in this feminization and aestheticization of the colonial. The objects described create a sublime aura of beauty, and there is a subtle erasure of the violence through the comic mock heroic. But the sublimity and deep fascination for the commodity provides a sanctification of the colonial process, and this deep misogyny is superimposed upon the colonial. To conclude, the rape of the lock is apparently a mock heroic on a trivial social brawl. Pope uses the heroic comical to trivialize, feminize, but aestheticize the epic. Belinda's hyperbolic beauty, as well as the glamour of the colonial objects, creates a sublime aura in the text, underlining a commodity fetishism that ironically merges narcissistic pride with nationalist celebration. The subtle presence of violence and rape associates the female body and colonial territory, whereby the poem emerges along with Defoe's Robinson Crusoe as an aesthetic validation of and celebration of the process and result of colonialism. That is all that I had to say on the subject, and it is with that I would like to bring this recording to a close.